Okay, great. So great to be here talking to you today. As Jonathan said, I'm a kind of late addition to the program. So instead of giving you a new piece of work, I'm going to give you an overview of this forthcoming book. And you should have the manuscript in your hand. Thank you for cheering for that joke. So if you don't have a handout, there was some by the door earlier, you should be able to get one. Okay, so let's get going. What this book is about the ways in which real-world democracies fall short of democratic ideals and why those shortfalls matter, especially to the rights and duties of ordinary citizens. So the motivation for this project was a bunch of kind of striking and troubling claims about how real-world democracies work from empirical political scientists. So let's read some of those claims. So one of these claims is by Walter Lippmann, writing in the 1920s. So he claimed that the citizen gives but a little of his time to public affairs, has but a casual interest in fact, but a poor appetite for theory. Okay, 20 years later, Joseph Schumpeter claims that the typical citizen drops down to a lower level of mental performance than the political sphere. He argues and analyzes in a way he would readily recognize as infantile within the sphere of his real interests. He becomes a primitive again. So strong stuff, right? So when Lippmann and Schumpeter were writing this, that kind of evidence was really journalistic. It was like kind of reading history, talking to people, perusing current events. And the scientific basis of their discipline during that time was being transformed by the representative survey. So these allowed us to ask a really small number of people questions and see how a much larger number would answer, okay? And so that meant for the first time around like the 40s and 50s, we were able to really make reliable generalizations about large populations. But this methodological transformation didn't actually transform this pessimistic picture of ordinary citizens that political scientists came to. So see this quote from Philip Converse in the mid-60s. He says that large parts of the electorate do not have meaningful beliefs, even on issues that have formed the basis of intense political controversy among elites for substantial periods of time. So these new survey methods supported rather than opposed this pessimistic picture of ordinary citizens. So let's jump forward 40 years. Larry Bartels in 2008 claims, talking about the US, that the modern Senate comes a good deal closer to equal representation of wealth rather than equal representation of citizens. So we've moved away from kind of this pessimistic picture of ordinary citizens. Now we're talking about the problems of who political elites respond to. Bartels thinks that in the US at least, money talks. But the picture here isn't that kind of representatives are puppeteered by wealthy interests. The picture is that kind of policymakers basically decide for themselves what policy is going to be like, and are largely, to a large extent, immune from outside influence. So that's what Matthew Grossman thinks anyway, writing in 2012. So he thinks that the results of the policy process are determined by the interactions among policy makers themselves. The public has quite limited impact. So as I say, these claims seem to me striking and they seem to me troubling. What my project is about is why these claims matter. So how exactly do these kind of findings, if they are findings, undermine democratic values? What does the undermining of these democratic values mean to us as kind of ordinary citizens in a democracy? Okay, so that's the project. So part of that project involved sketching what makes democracy valuable in the first place. Okay. And here I want to distinguish between intrinsic values and instrumental values. So a lot of people think democracy is instrumentally valuable. That means it's valuable because it has good causal consequences. Maybe it averts famine, reduces the risk of war, or leads to economic growth. So those are all kind of empirical claims about consequences of democracy. They're all controversial. It's hard to find kind of clear-cut evidence for this because it's hard to study. My interest is somewhat different. I'm interested in what makes democracy intrinsically valuable in itself besides its causal consequences. Okay, so why think democracy is intrinsically valuable? Partly on the basis of our judgments about cases, right? So imagine you're in the following situation. Suppose you could set up in the UK tomorrow a benevolent, competent dictatorship, right? You could kind of get rid of our democratic system and put a really competent, benevolent dictator in charge. Plausibly, this person's policies would have better consequences than the current government. They might be more competent at ruling us than Rishi Sunak is. Still, I think we'd have some weighty reason not to set up such a dictatorship. There's something lost by rule under even a benevolent, competent, instrumentally good dictatorship. And that motivates the idea that democracy is valuable in itself, not only for its causal consequences. Okay, so what makes democracy kind of intrinsically valuable? I think here we should adopt a kind of pluralistic picture. There are several different intrinsic democratic values. Not that many, 2, in fact. Equality and autonomy. Right, so the first part of this picture is democracies are distinctively egalitarian, and that's valuable. So the thought here is that democracies realize equal distributions of political power because everyone has one vote, and it's valuable to have equal distributions of political power. So why are equal distributions of political power valuable? So on the one hand, because asymmetries of power are objectionable. The idea here is that asymmetries of power generate objectionably inegalitarian relationships, relationships of subordination or domination. So think here the relationship of master to slave, or lord to peasant, or upper caste to lower caste. The idea is that we each have a claim against being subjected to these relationships. And one of the things democracy does is help preclude such relationships by precluding certain power asymmetries. Okay. But I don't think that exhausts the kind of egalitarian aspect of democracy's value. So I think there are also kind of positively valuable egalitarian relationships. So it's not just that kind of inegalitarian relationships are bad, it's also that there are some kind of egalitarian relationships which are good in themselves. So think here of personal friendships. So I think your friendships are valuable. And I think being in a friendship involves in part kind of caring about your friends, caring about their well-being, caring about their judgment, but also friendship in the personal case is an egalitarian relationship. It's a defect, I think, in your friendships if they're very inegalitarian, if one of you kind of always decides the contours of what your relationship, what you do together. Okay. But friendship, I think, doesn't have to be this kind of intimate face-to-face relationship. I think you can get an analogously valuable relationship on a civic scale. So we can have something like friendship with our kind of co-citizens. Maybe this is what French revolutionaries were talking about when they were talking about fraternity. The idea is that these civic friendships exist when we care about the well-being of our fellow citizens, we care about their judgment, and we're in egalitarian relationships with them. So democracy can facilitate, on the one hand, the avoidance of these bad kinds of inegalitarian relationships, on the other hand, the facilitation of these positively valuable civic friendships. Okay, so that spells out the egalitarian aspects of what makes democracy intrinsically valuable. Does that exhaust what makes democracy intrinsically valuable? No, it doesn't. I don't think it does anyway. To see that, I want you to think about the following case. So imagine we kind of realized a perfectly equal distribution of power, right? By making it so none of us had any political power at all. So for example, suppose we put in place an algorithm to govern us. This algorithm, let's imagine, is really instrumentally good, always enacts kind of the best policies, but none of us have any influence over the algorithm. Okay, so here, clearly we're not in egalitarian relationships with one another because none of us have any kind of political influence whatsoever. Still, I think there's an objection to being governed by an algorithm. It's better for us to have a say over what our government does. I think this idea motivates the thought that there's another aspect of democracy's value, what I call democratic autonomy or self-rule. And again, I want you to get a grip on this by thinking about the personal case. So I think it's valuable for you to be author of your personal affair, for you to be the one who kind of determines what career you pursue, who you marry, where you live. This kind of gives you authorship over your personal sphere. Analogously, I think it's valuable for us to be the authors of our social and political affairs. That means us collectively determining the things government does, the important features of our society, like the nature of economic relationships, the nature of the criminal justice system. This gets our kind of collective intentions manifest in government policy, which is valuable for parallel reasons to our individual intentions being manifest in your personal life, in each of your personal lives. Okay. But to get that, I think we clearly need to have a causal contribution to what the government does. If you don't kind of have a causal contribution to anything, to something, you can't really be author of it. Democracy facilitates that causal contribution by voting. We make a contribution to what policies the government enacts, for example. So democracies help realise this value of democratic autonomy. Okay. So there are these two things, I think, which are intrinsically valuable about democracy: equality and self-rule or democratic autonomy. These are valuable in a theological sense, right? It's good to get these things, but also we have kind of rights implicated in these values. So we have rights not to be subordinated, claims against subordination. We have rights at least to enjoy the opportunity for autonomous authorship of our social and political affairs. Okay. So that's my picture of what makes democracy valuable. So why does that matter? You know, most of us are not going to be ever in a position of deciding whether a country has democratic institutions or doesn't have democratic institutions. Few of us are actually going to have that kind of political power. So who cares whether our systems realise these democratic values? What I want to argue now is that the realisation of these democratic values is actually really important for your rights and duties. They matter to what you're obligated to do. So one aspect of this concerns legitimacy. So a government is legitimate, right, is the definition, when it can permissibly enforce its laws. That means it can punish you for breaking laws, throw you in jail, for example. So I think legitimacy is going to hinge on the realisation of these democratic values, i.e. democracies might well be legitimate, non-democracies are not. But what I want to focus on in this talk is actually a different kind of property of governments: political authority. So governments have authority when we have moral obligations to obey their laws, when you should do what they say. So think here of tax laws or laws forbidding drug use. Governments have authority when you're morally obligated to pay your taxes or to not take drugs if the government tells you not to do so. Okay. What I want to argue is that democratic systems which realise these values, have authority. We have moral obligations to obey democratic laws. But generally speaking, we're not going to have moral obligations to obey laws in autocracies or in very imperfect democracies that don't realise these values. Okay. To start you off with that argument, I want to point to a very obviously democratic pillar of authority. So imagine you're in a very well-functioning democracy, a democracy where everyone has equal influence over the laws and your fellow citizens are law-abiding, they obey the laws. So here, there's a fairly straightforward argument that you are going to have at least some moral reason to obey the laws. The argument is this: because your fellow citizens obey the laws, you have power over them. Why? Because you have influence over the laws and they obey the laws. So if you avoid obeying the laws, if you don't obey the laws, then you rob them of reciprocal power over you. Right? They are not going to have power over you via their influence over the laws. So you subject them to an asymmetry of power. I mentioned earlier that these asymmetries of power are objectionable. We have a claim against being subjected to asymmetries of power. So this is going to give you a reason to obey democratic laws. So that's a very distinctively democratic basis for political authority. We have reasons to obey democratic laws to avoid putting ourselves above our fellow citizens. Okay, that doesn't establish that autocracies lack authority. It might be that in kind of non-democratic systems, we should obey the laws, but for very different reasons. So what I want to do now is go through some different arguments in support of political authority, and show that, interestingly, they pretty much only work, if they work at all, in democratic systems. Okay, so the kind of theories of political authority only apply to pretty well-functioning democracies. So let's start with associative theories of political authority. So these theories say that when you're in a valuable relationship with somebody, you have reason to kind of care about what they want and try and like help them get what they want, not to frustrate the satisfaction of their wants. Okay. How do we get from that to a duty to obey the law? We get from that to a duty to obey the law by the following claim. One, kind of relationships of political community are valuable relationships. So we have valuable relationships with our fellow citizens. You should think of these relationships on the model of familial relationships like fraternity or sorority, or your relationship with your parents. They're not chosen, non-voluntary relationships, but still can be valuable, okay? And then we need a crucial further claim that the laws express what our fellow citizens want. So this kind of duty to care about the preferences of people we're in valuable relationships with leads to a duty to obey the law in order to avoid frustrating their desires, okay? So that's an associative theory of political obligations. So spelled out that way, I think it's pretty obvious that these theories are only going to work in democratic political systems. Why? Because it's just wholly implausible that the laws express what our fellow citizens want in autocracies. When a dictator makes the laws, or a small group of oligarchs or plutocrats, and the laws don't express what our fellow citizens want, they express what the dictator wants. So these associative theories do not establish an obligation to obey the law in autocracies. Okay, let's look at a different kind of theory, a fair share theory of political obligation. So what do these theories say? Is that we have duties to obey the laws because doing so is doing our fair to contribute to a cooperative scheme as the state from which we all benefit. The idea here is that we should think of the state as a cooperative scheme from which we benefit. We benefit from it because it educates us, protects us, provides us with healthcare. And when we benefit from a cooperative scheme, we have duty to maintain it. So imagine, for example, that you're a farmer in a village, and all the other farmers maintain a system of irrigation channels which feed your fields with water. Here, plausibly, you've got a duty to maintain this cooperative scheme of maintaining these irrigation channels. Similarly, people who think that these fair share theories are true think we have a duty to maintain the state cooperative scheme. Okay, then the idea is to maintain the state, we have to obey the laws. That's the idea. So that's a fair share theory of political obligations. But also these theories, I think, only really apply in democracies. So why is that? The reason that is because we don't have duties to maintain all kind of cooperative schemes we benefit from. Right. Suppose a cooperative scheme severely mistreats you, either by violating your rights or by kind of distributing its benefits extremely unevenly. So think of this like kind of irrigation scheme in a village. Imagine that kind of there's just a small number of people in control of this scheme, and they don't like kind of merely request you to help maintain the irrigation channels. They kind of hire armed agents who threaten to beat you up unless you maintain them. And imagine the water from these irrigation channels. Some of it ends up in your fields, but most of it ends up in their fields. Okay. So here, even if you benefit a bit from the scheme, maybe you've got like kind of prudential reason to help maintain the scheme because you don't want to get beaten up, but you don't have a moral obligation to maintain the scheme because the ordinary operations of the scheme involve violating your rights and involve the uneven distribution of the benefits from the scheme. So I think we should think of autocratic states as a bit like this, okay? So autocratic states violate our rights to non-subordination. They violate our rights to enjoy at least the opportunity of autonomy. And the benefits of autocratic states, for example, the benefits of not being subordinated, of kind of autonomously authoring our affairs, are very unevenly distributed. They mainly attach to the rulers of such states. So again, these fair share theories only apply to democratic states. Okay, let's look at a third theory of political obligations, which are well-known promissory theories. So these theories say we've all promised to obey the laws, so we have a moral obligation to do so. So these theories are kind of much maligned. People think, like, when have we promised to obey the laws? Maybe I think these theories are a bit too maligned. So I don't know how many people here are immigrants in the United Kingdom. But if you're an immigrant to any country, if you naturalise, usually you actually have to swear an oath of allegiance to obey the laws. Plausibly, merely by entering, you make an implicit promise to obey the laws. In the UK, that covers about 10 million people, a lot of people. So these theories do apply to a lot of people. But again, I think these theories plausibly only apply in democratic states. Why? Because when you make a promise to someone who then kind of deeply wrongs you, that undermines their claim on you to keep your promise. Suppose you promise to pick me up from the airport someday, right? And then the day before, I beat you up. Maybe this doesn't work. You know, the week before, I fly out and I come back. But here, right, because I've wronged you in such a serious way, it doesn't look like I can any longer press my claim against you to keep your promise. I forfeited my claim. I think autocratic states do this, right, by violating the rights of their citizens, by not satisfying their claim against subordination, their right to autonomy. Okay. If that's true, these promissory obligations are also not going to apply in autocratic states. So what does that show? What that shows is there are all these possible pillars of political authority, of obligations to obey the laws. Generally speaking, they only apply in democratic states. They do not apply in autocratic states, or more broadly, states which don't achieve these democratic values. Actually, I think the situation is somewhat more severe than that. So let's go back to these democratic theories of authority. So these theories say I should obey the laws in order to avoid kind of giving myself more power than my fellow citizens. But what does obedience to the law do in an autocracy? It doesn't kind of augment the power of your fellow citizens, it augments the power of whoever makes the laws. So if you're in a dictatorship, obeying the laws augments the power of the dictator, gives them more power over you and more power probably over your fellow citizens. So actually in autocracies, very plausibly, we have egalitarian reasons to avoid obeying the laws in order to avoid subjecting our fellow citizens to more severe asymmetries of power. So the general story here is that the achievement of kind of these democratic values of autonomy and equality really matter practically to you, to your duties as citizens. Specifically, in countries that achieve these values, it's very plausible that you do have obligations to obey the laws. In countries that don't achieve these values, it's very implausible that you have obligations to obey the laws. Okay, so that makes kind of practically important the question of to what extent do real world democracies like the UK, like India, France, Germany, the US, achieve these values. And now we're going to talk about that. So here I'm going to focus on the United States. Okay, that's for two reasons. So one is because you all care about the US. The US is obviously a very important case. Important because the world's second biggest democracy, debatably the world's oldest democracy, clearly a country the politics of which matters enormously to the rest of the world. So it's clearly an important case. Second, we actually just know much more about how politics works in the United States than basically in any other country in the world. That's because a disproportionate number of the world's political scientists live in the US and they disproportionately study the US. So we can be much more concrete about how American politics works and how, say, Indian politics works. Okay, so let's evaluate the extent to which the US achieves these values. The first kinds of democratic failures I want to talk about are failures that arise at the elite level of politics. That means they arise from the nature of and behaviour of elected officials. So let's start with the question of popular control. The observation here is that representatives, in the US context, this means Congress people, are not under the control of their constituents. So what does that mean? A representative is under the control of their constituents when how they vote in the legislature, how they use their political power is determined by how their constituents want them to use their political power. So if their constituents want them to vote more liberally, they vote more liberally. Their constituents want them to vote more conservatively, they vote more conservatively. This is a kind of a general notion of control, right? You're under my control is how you behave is determined by how I want you to behave. So if I want you to leave the room, that causes you to leave the room. I want you to stay, that causes you to stay. So yeah, the observation is in the US, the kind of Congress people are not under the control of their constituents. The evidence for that is basically kind of from observational data. So essentially, once you control the party, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, the ideological tenor of legislative voting behaviour, so basically how liberal or how conservative their voting record is, does not kind of correlate very strongly at all with the liberalism or conservatism of their district. That means legislative voting behaviour does not match controlling the party the preferences of their constituents. Okay, what does that mean? So that means, like, if we look among kind of Republican representatives in the US, Republicans from very, very liberal Republican districts, they vote kind of basically the same, similar level of conservatism as Republicans from very, very conservative districts. Similarly, Democrats from very, very liberal districts vote basically the same as Democrats from very, very conservative districts. So what does this suggest? It suggests that constituents can affect the ideology of the legislator that ends up representing them, because they can vote for a Republican or a Democrat. Republicans are much more conservative as a groups than Democrats. So they can select representatives into office with an ideology that like kind of vaguely matches their preferences. But once in office, these legislators are no longer responsive, or at least not very responsive to the preferences of their constituents. So representatives are not kind of under the control of their constituents in any ongoing way. That's the observation. So who cares? Why does that matter? So I think to see why this matters, you have to recognize that there's actually a real tension between these kind of egalitarian ideals of democracy and our actual institutions of representative democracy. Why? Because in representative democracies, there are just clearly enormous asymmetries of political power. So representatives have much more power than ordinary citizens. They're the ones who decide what the laws will be. They're the ones who oversee and manage the state. So on the face of it, representative democracy is actually a deeply inegalitarian system. But there is a way, I think, to diffuse this tension. The way is precisely by putting representatives under popular control. In the US context, under the control of their constituents. The thought here is that when how you exercise power is under external control, your kind of power over somebody is no longer objectionable, no longer kind of gives rise to these relationships of subordination. Okay, so just to illustrate that thought, think about your kind of relationship with a police officer you see on the street. That person has a lot of power over you, they can arrest you. When is that power objectionable? So it's definitely objectionable if they can arrest you on a whim, if they can kind of discretionarily exercise that power. But if how they use that power is under the control of the police chief and legislature through them, the asymmetry of power is no longer objectionable. That's the idea. The problem is if this mechanism of reconciling representative democracy with equality clearly is not operative, at least in the US case, because we don't have popular control of representatives. So the relationship between representatives and ordinary citizens is one of these objectionably inegalitarian relationships, a relationship of subordination. And that's the first observation. The picture here, though, isn't that representatives kind of decide entirely what to do, like what they do is like entirely up to them. They are subject to some external influence. But looking at where that external influence comes from identifies some more problems. And one big problem here, especially in the US case, is money talks, right? Looks like the wealthy have much more influence over US politics than everyone else. I'll give you two pieces of evidence for that. There are kind of two strands in the empirical research here. So one looks at how the wealthy can influence policymakers' behaviour. So a flagship study here is a study from Larry Bartels in 2008. He looks at the ideological tenor of representative voting behaviour in Congress, how liberal or how conservative they were. And he looks at whether that correlates with the ideologies of their constituents of different income brackets. Does it correlate with the ideologies of their richest constituents, their middle-class constituents, or their poorest constituents? He finds that there's no association between the preferences of their poorest constituents and their voting behaviour in Congress. A second kind of study looks at policy directly. So the flagship study here comes from a guy called Martin Gilens in 2012. And Gilens looks at kind of all the policy changes you can get data on between 1980 and 2000 about. And here's what he does. He looks at what kind of the preferences of the public were on these policy issues, and he looks at how policy changes. And then he looks at what happened when the richest 10% of Americans disagreed on policy with the poorest 90%, so had different views about how they wanted policy to change. He finds in these cases, it's much, much, much more likely that policy changed in the direction of the richest 10%. Okay, so he infers that the wealthy in the US have much more power than the not wealthy. A not particularly surprising conclusion, but a conclusion that clearly generates some very serious problems for the achievement of these democratic values, right? So first, it generates egalitarian problems. And the problem here is that before we identified that there were these objectionably inegalitarian relationships between representatives and ordinary citizens, what this shows is that there are also these kind of relationships of subordination between rich and poor. Why? Because the rich have more political power. But more distinctively, this now kind of generates some problems for self-rule or the achievement of democratic autonomy. So the kind of stuff to do with popular control didn't straightforwardly undermine the achievement of democratic autonomy, the kind of achievement of the realization of kind of public preferences in government policy. Why? Because it was consistent with the kind of public still being able to select representatives with their broad ideologies. The observation was just that they don't control them when they're in office. But these kind of claims about the influence of the wealthy in US politics now pose a problem also to the achievement of self-rule. Why? Because the wealthy have more influence over policy, that crowds out and reduces the contribution that everyone else can make to policy. And if you don't make much of a contribution to policy, that reduces the extent to which you can be self-ruling with respect to it, to which it can count as like as something you autonomously author, an expression of your preferences. Okay, so that's the problem with wealth in politics. I'll skip this problem of interest groups. Similar issues arise here as arise with the issue of wealth. Let's instead skip to some issues that arise from how time interacts with these democratic values. I think the really interesting empirical finding here concerns what is sometimes called partisan gaps in representation. The observation is that politicians tend to listen to the concerns of their own supporters more than the concerns of other people. They they respond to the preferences and interests of co-partisans more than cross-partisans. Okay. To be clear, the observation is not that they kind of enact kind of the policies their co-partisans want. Rather, it's on an ongoing basis. They respond more to the interests of their co-partisans. So I'll give you one study in support of this picture, which is by a guy called Atef Mian and some of his co-authors. The Mian study is voting behaviour in Congress around the 2008 financial crisis. So Obama introduced a bill called the Homeowner Relief Bill in 2008. And this bill does what it sounds like it does. It kind of provided relief to people with mortgages. So a lot of people were defaulting on their mortgages, tried to reduce default rates. Okay, so all Democrats in Congress voted for this bill. It was proposed by a Democratic president, in essence. The Republican vote split. Some Republicans voted for it and others didn't. Okay. Republicans were more likely to vote for homeowner relief when there were higher rates of default in their constituencies. So people were defaulting on their mortgage more in their constituencies. So far, so good. Right. Interestingly, though, Republicans were only responsive to the default rate among their Republican constituents. So what does that mean? If their Republican constituents were defaulting at higher rates, they were more likely to vote for this homeowner relief bill. If their kind of Democratic constituents were defaulting at higher rates, they were no more likely to vote for the bill. So what that illustrates is that representatives, quite generally, are responsive more to the interests and preferences of their co-partisans and cross-partisans. Okay, why does that matter? It matters because of how equality interacts with time, right? So one picture here is a view which is sometimes called lifetime egalitarianism. The view says that what we care about when we care about kind of people having equal power over one another is that their power over one another balances out over their entire life. So if I have power over you at one time, then you have power over me at another time. So I think this view is pretty clearly implausible on the basis of just intuitions about cases. So think of an extreme case instantiating this balancing out of power. Suppose for the first 6 months of every year, you're my slave, and for the next 6 months of every year, I'm your slave. Okay. I think this is not an awesome relationship we have. In fact, I think there's a deep egalitarian objection to it. And the objection just is that for the first 6 months of every year, you're subordinated to me, and then I'm subordinated to you. What that supports is a much more kind of demanding view of how equality interacts with time. We want equal distributions of power basically at every time. Okay. But that means these partisan gaps of representation are going to be deeply troubling. Why? Because they mean that when Democrats are in power, what that means is when they have majorities in Congress, the presidency, ordinary Democrats are going to be more powerful and have asymmetric power over ordinary Republicans. Why? Because they will have the ear of government officials, the people who make policy, and ordinary Republicans won't. When Republicans are in power, the opposite will be the case. And each of these relationships of asymmetric power are objectionable. So what these partisan gaps of representation show is that we have these kind of inegalitarian relationships across party lines. Okay. I'll skip this stuff about inertia. To sum up these the lesson from these elite level failures, what we've seen is a lack of popular control over representatives, means there are these inegalitarian relationships between representatives and ordinary citizens. The influence of money in politics creates inegalitarian relationships between different income groups, and these partisan gaps in representation create cross-partisan inegalitarian relationships. Let's look now at a very different class of democratic failure. Democratic failure that arises not from the actions and behaviour of elected officials, but rather from the nature of ordinary voters. And we'll start with our cognitive shortcomings. So the first observation here is that we don't know very much about politics. So in the US, fewer than half of Americans know who the candidates are in their districts. Many Americans don't know, many voters in general don't know the policies that different political candidates or parties support, don't know who's for tax cuts, who's for increasing spending on welfare benefits. Many people don't know important economic facts about economic conditions, how the economy is doing, is it growing, what's the employment rate look like. Generally speaking, we don't know who the political actors are, what they support, what the effects of their policies are. The evidence for this, by the way, just an enormous body of survey evidence. So since at least the 50s, we've been running surveys, representative surveys in many, many large democracies, giving ordinary voters quizzes on how much they know about politics. And we don't do very well at those quizzes. Okay. The second kind of cognitive shortcoming I want to talk about is how we reason about politics. So we often reason about politics in what looks like a very irrational way. We do a lot of motivated reasoning. That means we try and bend the evidence to kind of defend our pre-existing beliefs or show our side, our party side, in a good light. The evidence for that is essentially experimental. So one of the flagship studies here are by two guys, Milton Lodge and Charles Tabor. So here's what they did. They asked a bunch of people what their political views were on various issues. So for example, were they for gun control or against gun control? They then got these people to come to their lab in Stony Brook in Long Island. And then they sat these people down in front of a computer and got them to click on arguments. And these arguments were pretty clearly either going to be pro-gun control arguments or anti-gun control arguments. What do they find? They find that pro-gun control people click on the pro-gun control arguments, anti-gun control people click on the anti-gun control arguments. And this whole process affects people's beliefs. People who were initially pro-gun control become more fervently pro-gun control. People who were initially anti-gun control become more fervently anti-gun control. So what they infer is that here, ordinary voters are kind of gathering evidence in a way and then reasoning in a way to defend their initial beliefs. Many other studies have found that we gather evidence and reason in a way to defend our party affiliation. We have a party affiliation, and when we interpret evidence, we cast it in a light that makes our party look good. Plausibly, I think this involves a lot of failures in reasoning, irrationalities. Okay, so why does that stuff matter? Who cares about these cognitive shortcomings? I think these shortcomings pose an enormous barrier to the achievement of democratic autonomy. Why? Because the value here, right, was the value of autonomously authoring our social and political affairs. But there are constraints on when you can be in a position to autonomously author anything. Specifically, there are epistemic constraints. If you don't know much about your options, you're not in a position to make an autonomous choice. So imagine you're deciding whether to be a banker or an academic. You just don't have any idea what these careers involve. You know, you don't know about the long hours or the bad job market or something. You are just totally ignorant. Here, I think you can't make an autonomous career choice. But similarly, voters don't really know much about their kind of options when they're in the ballot box. They don't know about the policies of the parties or the outcomes of those parties. They often just don't know who the candidates are. And when they do have true beliefs here, they kind of come to these beliefs through these irrational means, and so those beliefs are going to be unjustified, again, undercutting their knowledge. So our cognitive shortcomings undermine the achievement of these democratic values. Okay, let's move to a second math level failure to do with polarization. So everyone knows that the US specifically, and some other countries, say Hungary, Poland, Turkey, have become deeply, deeply polarized in recent years. Often when philosophers talk about this, by the way, they think we over-intellectualize it. People tend to focus on people's beliefs getting further apart, people's kind of attitude, people's policy views getting further apart. This, I do not think, is the really important phenomena here. In the US context, the important phenomena is that ordinary Americans across party lines have come to hate one another. So how do we know that? One way to tap that is by asking cross-partisans to describe one another. So nowadays, cross-partisans, i.e. Democrats describing Republicans or Republicans describing Democrats, describe one another as hypocritical, mean, selfish, a threat to the nation. They use these extraordinarily negative descriptions for cross-partisans. Another way you can tap this is by kind of feeling thermometer ratings. You can ask people how coldly or warmly they feel towards different social groups. People feel extraordinarily coldly towards cross-partisans. And you can also just look at how people behave. So nowadays in the US, Democrats, for example, have become increasingly unwilling to date Republicans, to form romantic relationships with Republicans, to work with them in an employment setting. Similarly, Republicans have been unwilling to do this with Democrats. All this shows that this kind of loathing has kind of arisen across party lines. That's the kind of really interesting aspect of polarization. Why does this matter to our democratic values? Well, when I was talking about elite level failures, I talked about ways in which kind of the actions of politicians lead to power asymmetries, and so lead to these kind of objectionably inegalitarian relationships. But there was another aspect of democratic equality, right? These kind of civic friendships. I said democracy, in a really good case, can facilitate civic friendships between relatives. And effective polarization severs these civic friendships. Why? To be friends with anybody, you need not to hate them, right? You can't be friends with someone when you hate them and they hate you. So effective polarization destroys the possibility of civic friendships across party lines. Not only that, replaces what might be a positively valuable relationship, a civic friendship, with a kind of enmity. So I think these are just intrinsically bad relationships, relationships of enmity, and not inegalitarian relationships. So think of, I don't know if you have enemies, but you know, enmity is the kind of relationship you have with somebody when you don't care about one another's well-being, you're kind of in competition, you're working against one another, and maybe you dislike one another. I think it's bad to be in that sort of relationship with people, and what kind of effective polarization constitutes is enmity across party lines. Okay, let's look at jump to a third mass level failure, voting behaviour. So I've told you voters don't know that much about politics, we reason about it irrationally, but what actually drives our vote? What motivates us to vote the way we do? A very optimistic picture here would say, what we do is we look at the policy platforms of the different parties, we vote for the party which has policies that we endorse. And that's how we become author of these policies. By and large, that picture is not correct. That is not what motivates voters. We know that for two reasons. Well, two reasons I'll tell you. First reason is you can just ask voters why they voted the way they did. You can give open-ended interviews, kind of asking voters to answer in their own words what motivated their vote. When you do these interviews, and these interviews have been, the first class of these studies was actually in the 1960s, well, late 50s, in a book called The American Voter, but about 15 years ago, a guy called Michael Lewis Beck updated this whole book and did them again in 2008. When you do these interviews, fewer than 20% of voters mention policy issues at all. When you ask them, why did you vote, say, for Bush in 2004, fewer than 20% of people mention policy issues at all. And those who mention policy issues, most of these mentions, very fleeting mentions, a very small percentage of voters give detailed policy justifications. That just suggests not many people are voting on the issues. Another piece of evidence comes from panel studies. So what a panel study is it's a set of surveys. Panel studies involve surveying the same people at different times. Okay. And so Gabriel Lenz, political scientist, collates a bunch of these panel studies in a 2012 study. And he collates studies in which a political issue becomes really salient between different waves of these panel studies. Right, so his flagship example is Social Security in the 2000 US presidential election. So the policy question here was whether individuals should be allowed to invest their Social Security, that's their pension, in the stock market or not. Bush thought they should be, Gore didn't. No one cared about this in 1999. In fact, you see very little difference in the views of ordinary Democrats and ordinary Republicans on this issue. In the first wave of this study. But it becomes really politically salient in October of the year 2000. Why? Because Bush and Gore clash over it in a televised debate. Spend about 10 minutes arguing about it. That makes this kind of issues people now realise is on the radar. So what do voters do in response to the rising salience of this issue? So here's what doesn't happen. It's not the case that kind of people who initially planned to vote for Bush realise that they have a different view on the social security issues than they do, and so change their vote intention to Gore. Almost nobody does that. Rather, what happens is that people change their policy views. So Republicans adopt Bush's policy view, Democrats adopt Al Gore's policy view. What's going on here is that instead of choosing our party on the basis of their policy platform, we choose our policy platform on the basis of pre-existing party affiliation. So all this suggests that we're not doing much of this issue voting. Why does that matter? That means we can't really be autonomous authors of government policy, because to be the autonomous author of something, your preferences or intentions about that thing have to make some causal influence on it, have to have some causal connection to it. But our preferences about policy, if we have them, are not even driving our vote. And so there's no channel through which they could straightforwardly make an influence on how government policy actually occurs. Okay, so how do we vote? What does motivate us in the ballot box? So one thing that motivates us is group identities. So think here about Catholics voting for Kennedy in the 60s, or Black people voting for Obama. Right, group identities are a powerful mover of voters. Another thing we vote on is performance, okay? So a lot of people vote against incumbents when economic conditions are bad. You might think this final kind of voting helps rescue some of this autonomous authorship. So the picture here would be, maybe we can be autonomous author of good political outcomes. Why? Because we vote against bad performers, and that incentivizes politicians to perform well. Okay, so we do make a causal contribution to good performance. But that thought also probably doesn't work. And the problem is that we're pretty incompetent performance voters. So this comes from a bunch of claims by two political scientists, Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels. They think we vote myopically and blindly. So what does that mean? We vote myopically in that we only care about, say, economic conditions around election day. So we vote for an incumbent when the economy is doing well in the 6 months running up to the election day. Economic conditions before then, put no ice with voters, do not affect kind of whether an incumbent gets more or fewer votes. We vote blindly in the sense that we punish incumbents for things outside their control. So Aiken and Bartels' flagship case here is rainfall. So they look at incumbent vote share in counties of unusually high or unusually low rainfall. So low rainfall leads to droughts, high rainfall often leads to floods. They find people vote against incumbents when they get extreme rainfall. But incumbents don't control the weather. So all of this undercuts the extent to which we actually make a causal contribution to good performance. So even this kind of this idea that we are authors of good performance is undercut by the actual incompetence of our voting behaviour. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that, so these elite level failures, they kind of showed that there were these enormous barriers to really achieving kind of democratic equality. There are these deep inegalitarian relationships between representatives and ordinary citizens, between rich and poor, between cross partisans. The mass level failures on top of that show there are enormous barriers to achieving democratic autonomy, to really kind of authoring our political affairs autonomously. We're not made of the right kind of stuff to really be autonomous authors of politics. We don't care enough about politics. We don't know enough about it. We don't really even vote based on policy issues. So I think in the US context, that suggests that US democracy achieves very little deep democratic ideals. So how does that generalize to other democracies? Well, question for future research. But the true answer is some of these kind of findings definitely generalize very broadly. So all the findings to do with mass level failures, like political ignorance, those generalize to almost every large democracy we have data on. It's not like kind of French people or Indian people know much more about their politics than American people. The findings to do with elite level failures sometimes generalize, but sometimes we have less good evidence basis for it. But in many cases, it looks like real world democracies are just not going to achieve the things that make democracy valuable in the first place. Okay, let's return to why that matters. So I started off right by arguing that we have duties to obey the law only in political systems that actually achieve these democratic values. So if that's true, what we've just shown is that American citizens do not have moral obligations to obey law. Okay. This also affects kind of other rights and duties of US citizens. So for a start, it affects whether people have a duty to vote. I think it does anyway. So it's very natural to think people have an obligation to vote. I think the best justification for that comes from a kind of fair share consideration argument. So the idea here is that we have a duty to kind of rescue our fellow citizens from bad government. And to do that, we have to vote for good government. Okay. That helps rescue them from bad governments. We have to vote kind of competently, be informed about the issues. But actually, these kind of duties of rescue or these rights of rescue can be forfeited, right? So if I never rescue anyone else from bad government, then it looks like I have a very weak claim on you to rescue me. But most of our fellow voters, at least if you're an American, are voting kind of incompetently, are not kind of living up to their duties to rescue their fellow citizens from bad government. So also this is going to undermine our duty to vote. I claimed in passing that this undermines the legitimacy of the state. It undermines the extent to which states can permissibly enforce their laws. I also think it transforms what's permitted in political competition. Kind of transforms how we're permitted to try and compete and win power with one another. So the big takeaway here is that these kind of claims about the failures of real-world democracies have really important practical implications. They're the distinctive ethics of democracy. There's a set of rights and duties we would have in well-functioning democracies, and so the failure of our democracies to live up to these democratic ideals transforms the rights and duties of ordinary citizens. And that's all I have.